May it please the court. Members of the jury, the defendant's lies cannot hide the truth that was written with the victim's blood. Today you heard how Willie James was suffering from multiple head injuries. He had blood pouring down from his head, while the defendant, who didn't have a single visible injury, was covered in blood. He had Willie's blood on his shoes, on his pants, on his sweatshirt. Even his hands were covered in blood. And today he tried to wash that blood away with lies. He lied when he said he wasn't driving that night. He lied when he said he didn't use anything other than his fists and his elbows to fight Willie James. And he lied when he said he didn't even own a flashlight. But members of the jury, these lies cannot wash away the truth of what happened on October 2nd, 2014. So let's look past these lies for a moment. You heard a lot about Willie James. He's a war veteran. He's fought 3 tours in Iraq to protect our freedom. But he hasn't just fought to protect our freedom, but also to support a family. He's a loving husband, and he has 2 young children. You also heard about the defendant, a young 23-year-old kid, a self-described adrenaline junkie. The bigger the challenge, the better. He likes speeding fast because he loves the rush. October 2nd was no different for him because he found his next challenge. The military land is bigger than him, Willie James. Now on October 2nd, Willie was hanging out with one of his friends, J.T. Samuel. They had recently gotten back from a tour and finally had some time to relax. So they went to a football game. While there, Willie had a couple of drinks. So he did the responsible thing. He handed over his keys to J.T., who hadn't been drinking, and they headed to the 7-Eleven to grab a bite to eat. While there, that's when they ran into the defendant. The defendant was already drunk, and he knocked off a drink from the counter. It spilled on the ground, creating this huge mess. And Willie saw that. And when he saw it, he felt bad for the employees at the 7-Eleven. So he walked over to the defendant. He asked him nicely to clean it up. But that's when the defendant realized who his next challenge was. He told this big, burly man to clean that mess up himself. Willie realized that this wasn't doing anything good. So he walked away. Walked outside, got in the truck with J.T., and they started to leave the parking lot. But what did the defendant do? He got in his Audi and he cut them off. He raced up that parking lot and slammed on his brakes right in front of the red truck. There was nothing in front of him, nothing preventing him from leaving. He stopped right in front of that truck. So Willie got out of the truck. He didn't know that it was the kid from inside. He asked the guy to move. Then he realized who it was. He realized this wasn't doing anything good because the kid flipped him off and smirked at him. He was understandably frustrated at this point, so he tapped the car. He said, "Move on." And it didn't work. He started to walk away. That's when the defendant grabbed that large metal flashlight and beat Willie in the head. Willie fell to the ground, and then the defendant wrestled him on the ground, causing multiple injuries. He started hitting him multiple times after he blindsided him with that flashlight. Then the police arrived at the scene. They separated the 2 of them. And you heard from the officer today. He told you how he saw Mr. James with these gashes on his head. And he saw the defendant without a single visible injury, covered in blood. He saw the blood on his shoes, the blood on his pants, the blood on his sweatshirt, the blood that was covering his hands. And then the defendant tried to wash that away with lies. The defendant told the officer, "I wasn't driving." He told the officer, "I know how to fight, but I was just using my hands and my elbows." He told the officer he didn't even own a flashlight. But the officer could see through these lies. It's important to know what he didn't tell came out of his mouth was a lie. But these lies cannot wash away the truth. And that's why the defendant sits before you on charges of first-degree assault and criminal domestic and disorderly conduct. Now, we, the state, we hold the burden of proof. We must prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, each and every element of the crimes that we've charged the defendant with. For first-degree assault, that means proving that the defendant acted with the intent to cause serious bodily injury, that he actually caused that serious bodily injury, and that he did so through use of a deadly weapon. To prove disorderly conduct, we must prove that the defendant engaged in a fight with Willie James, knowingly, intentionally, or recklessly in a public place. Now, we've established all of the elements of these crimes today. Disorderly conduct, that's clear. An officer arrived at the scene and saw the defendant wrestling Willie James on the ground, punching him, injuring him in a public parking lot. We provided you with the proof of those elements. Now, the next crime is just as clear, because the facts were written in blood. Intent to cause serious bodily injury. When the defendant picked up that large metal flashlight and swung at Willie James, that was his intent to cause those serious injuries that you saw. He knew what swinging that flashlight would do. These are the injuries that Willie James suffered from. Multiple wounds to his head. His eye was swollen shut. He had a fracture to his eye socket. He had to be rushed away to the hospital where he got a CT scan to see if there was any brain injury. Now, at the end of today's trial, the judge will come before you and explain to you the elements and what proves a serious bodily injury. And he'll explain that in the state of Lone Star, a fracture, like the one to Willie's eye socket, that is a serious bodily injury. Or the risk of impairment to a bodily organ, the type that he had because he had to have a CT scan, that is serious bodily injury. When you look at this picture, it's clear the injuries that Willie suffered from are indeed serious. And what was used to cause those injuries was a deadly weapon. The judge will explain that when an object is used to bludgeon a victim, that's a deadly weapon. And you heard today how he took out that flashlight and he bludgeoned Willie with it. We established all the elements of the crimes charged beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, when you go into deliberation, you'll be thinking about what exactly beyond a reasonable doubt means. But it's just as important to think about what it does not mean. Because beyond a reasonable doubt, that is not beyond all doubt. It's not beyond a shadow of a doubt. A reasonable doubt is not a possible, speculative, fanciful, or imaginary doubt. It is a doubt that is truly founded in reason. And today, when you look at this evidence, you will see that there is only one reasonable explanation for the injuries that Willie was suffering from and the fact that the defendant was covered in Willie's blood. And that's his guilt. We proved that to you today through two witnesses. First, you heard from the officer. Officer McNulty arrived on the scene and she told you everything that she saw. She told you about those serious injuries and how she had to charged the defendant with first-degree assault because he used that weapon to hurt Willie. And she then went to the hospital and saw Willie, took these photographs of those serious bodily injuries. And next, Willie took the stand. Willie came before you and he told you about those moments in the parking lot. How he didn't know he was going to be injured until it was too late. Until the defendant took out a flashlight and hit it. He fell to the ground, and then he was beaten repeatedly. We proved our elements to you today. Now, after we called our witnesses, the defense had their own opportunity. During the defense's case, they tried to convince you that this was self-defense. Now, self-defense requires proof that the defendant thought that Willie was going to use unlawful force against him. So, he acted with the amount of force that was necessary in bruise on his leg. And then you saw the injuries that Willie suffered. Remember that self-defense requires the amount of force that is reasonably necessary to prevent those injuries. But when you look at Willie's injuries, this is not self-defense. This is a brutal attack. He was hit multiple times. Now, during the defense's case, we asked you to keep in mind a question. What lies did you hear from the defense witnesses? But first you heard from the defendant himself. And when you heard from the defendant, you found out that he lied about driving that night. He lied about being drunk on the stand today. He lied when he said that he only used his fists and his elbows to fight Willie James. He lied when he said he didn't even own a flashlight. And you heard about why he lied. He lied to the officer because he was scared about getting in trouble. Because when he's about to get in trouble, he lies. And today he sits on the stand on charges of first-degree assault and disorderly conduct. Again, facing that same trouble. He is scared. So he's lying to you. It's lies on top of lies on top of lies. But the truth was written in blood. The blood that was on his hands on October 2nd, 2014. And his lies can't wash that away. Now, the next witness they called to the stand was Kelly Bradshaw. Now, she's the supposed eyewitness who arrived at the scene after everything started, whose vision was blocked most of the time, who didn't see who hit who first. But what's more important than what she saw and what she didn't see is what she said. Because like the defendant, she lied. She lied when she said that she saw the defendant being egged on in the parking lot that night. She lied when she said that she was parked when this all started. She lied when she said what she saw to the officer that night. And it's important to remember that both of the witnesses they called to the stand lied to you today. But members of the jury, their lies cannot wash away the truth about what happened on October 2nd, 2014. Because that truth was written in blood. Don't allow them to wash the blood off the defendant's hands. Find him guilty of both charges.
Please, the question. Members of the jury, this case was open and closed from the minute that it started. On October 2nd, the cop at the scene saw a military man with some blood on his face, and he took that man's words for it, that the so-called hippie kid beat him in the head with a flashlight. And from that simple accusation and that snap judgment, Pete Mitchell and the facts of what really happened that night were ignored. The case was open and closed. The cops didn't hear about how the alleged victim, William James, started picking on Pete in the store. They didn't hear how Mr. James stormed out of his car to the driver's side door of Pete's car to continue harassing Pete when he didn't move his car fast enough. They didn't take into consideration that on that night, Mr. James snapped and had Pete's legs trapped in the car and the door of his car, repeatedly slamming the door closed, causing injuries to Pete's legs. The cops didn't take into consideration that Pete Mitchell did what he had to do that night. He defended himself. I don't know about you members of the jury, but I have a story about a bully from 2nd grade. I'm sure you all have similar stories because I remember being on the playground when I was probably just 6 years old, and this boy came up to me. He was bigger than me, and he was stronger than me, and I didn't think anything of it until he told me to get off the swing. I didn't know why he was bossing me around when he could have just gotten on the swing next to me. So I stayed on the swing, happy as can be. But this guy, this little boy, he was used to getting his way with people. He wasn't used to having people stand up to him. So he came up to the swing and he pulled me off and he started pulling my hair. And members of the jury, in that split second, I remembered what my dad had told me about defending myself. He told me that I had to defend myself if I needed to. So I took my fist and I punched that bully. I didn't want to, and I never would have had he not done it to me and not instigated the fight, but I did what I had to do. Pete Mitchell's dad must have told him that same thing that my mom did. Because on October 2nd, he did what he had to do to avoid getting his legs broken. But that was ignored. Because the cops that night, this case was open and closed. Today, you heard a lot about Pete Mitchell. He's a young 23-year-old man born right here and raised right here in Lone Star County. As a graduate of Lone Star University with a degree in film and fine arts, he's able to travel the world and film his passion, skiing and snowboarding. On October 2nd, Pete was getting a bite to eat at the local 7-Eleven at around 2 a.m. It was really crowded, and at some point, an iced tea got knocked onto the ground. That's when the alleged victim, William James, saw Pete. James told you on the stand today that he stereotyped Pete as the little hippie kid with the long hair and the baggy hoodie on. He said he was immature, and that he was irritated by the fact that when he told Pete to clean up the mess that he didn't even cause, he was irritated. After so long in the military, Mr. James was used to having people follow his orders. So Mr. James started to threaten Pete and call him names. Pete was so scared, and in order to avoid confrontation, he left the store without getting the food that he went there for in the first place. But the cursing and the yelling in the store wasn't good enough for Mr. James because he followed through on his threats. Mr. James got in his car and swerved up to Pete's car when Pete was still trying to just back out and get out of the parking lot. J.T. Sanborn and William James both got out of their car and charged to Pete's driver's side window. Sanborn blocked the car so that Pete could drive away, and William James yanked Pete's driver's side door open. Pete stood up. He tried to talk some sense into Mr. James and explained that he was just trying to pull out of the parking lot. He didn't want any trouble. But by that point, Mr. James already had decided he was looking for a fight. He started slamming the driver's side door and crushing Pete's legs. Members of the jury, Pete was absolutely terrified. He reached down to the closest thing he could find, the flashlight that his mom had told him to keep on the front seat of his car. He reached over the car door and he hit Mr. James with it to try and get him to back away and stop trying to break his legs. But Mr. James didn't stop. Because when Pete got out from behind his car door, Mr. James grabbed him and yanked him back with a bear hug. And that bear hug was so forceful that they both went toppling onto the concrete. Mr. James hit his head on the concrete. Police arrived at the scene and pulled the two away from each other. But when the police saw that Mr. James was bleeding, they made the false assumption that Pete was the first aggressor. And then they saw Pete with the long hair and the bloodstained hoodie. And to the cops, his case was open and closed. Yes, Pete wasn't completely honest with the police. He made the stupid decision to say that the flashlight wasn't his. But members of the jury, the lies that he told right after he was attacked don't change the facts of what happened that night. They are not proof of guilt. After having just a moment to think about what had happened, Pete admitted to these lies. He admitted to you on the stand here today. He told the truth. He explained to you on the stand that he was just a scared kid, outnumbered. But he understands that on October 2nd, he did what he had to do. But now, just like the cops, the prosecution is ignoring the facts and pretending that this case is open and closed. And that is why we are here today. Because Pete Mitchell has been accused of first-degree assault and disorderly conduct. And in accusing Pete of these crimes, they alone hold the burden of proving to each of you, beyond a reasonable doubt, every element of the crimes charged. To prove first-degree assault, they must prove that Pete acted with the intent to cause serious bodily injury, that he caused serious bodily injury, and that he did so through the use of a deadly weapon. To prove to you disorderly conduct, they must prove that Pete knowingly, intentionally, or recklessly fought William James in a public place. All beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest burden in our judicial system. But there is also a defense to both of these crimes, self-defense. And that means that if Pete Mitchell used physical force against William James in order to defend himself from what he reasonably thought was the use of unlawful force by William James, and Pete used the force that he believed to be reasonably necessary to defend himself, then he is not guilty of either of those crimes charged. You learned today that Pete was trying to leave the parking lot, but he was chased down. He was not the original aggressor. Mr. James was, and you learned that Pete was terrified, so he did the only thing he could do. He protected himself. He grabbed the thing nearby to knock Mr. James away. He wasn't trying to harm him, just to do what he thought was reasonably necessary to protect himself. Now that we have provided the evidence of self-defense, it is the state who has the burden to prove that this isn't self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt, and that Pete attacked Mr. James with the intent to cause him serious bodily injury without provocation. Members of the jury, the state has failed to prove that to you here today. That's because there is a presumption of innocence for Pete. He could have sat back at that table, kicked up his legs today, and not said a single word. But the burden in today's case rests solely with the state, and that means they must prove to you that there is no reasonable alternative to what happened on October 2nd, 2014. But when Pete waived his right to silence, got up on the stand today and explained what happened and owned up to his lies, you heard that there is a very, very reasonable alternative to the prosecution's theory. That Pete defended himself because in that moment, it was his only option. But the cops that night, and now the prosecution, don't care. Because to them, this case is open and closed. The prosecution tried but failed to prove their case to you using two witnesses. First, they called Officer McNulty. Today, you learned that the officer ignored every other alternative to Mr. James' story of events. Because Officer McNulty saw the decorated war veteran and the hippie kid with the long hair, and the case was open and closed. So closed, in fact, that the officer didn't secure the scene, didn't use gloves when handling evidence, didn't conduct interviews for the eyewitnesses, didn't look for any footage of what happened, and ignored the two other versions of the story. What about that flashlight? There's no blood on it. And even if there was blood on it, we would never know. Because what did the officer do? He picked up that flashlight with a bare hand and put it in his pocket before anybody else had the chance to see it. Officer McNulty came onto the scene and saw Mr. James with a gash in his head. And at that point, he made up his mind. He didn't bother to do anything more to find out what happened. Picked up that flashlight, put it in his pocket, and snapped a picture of Mr. James. At that point, his investigation was complete. He didn't ask Pete if his legs were okay. The legs that had already begun to bruise. He never asked Pete if he was hurt, because to him, his case was open and closed. Next, the state called the alleged victim, Mr. James, who told you his version of what happened that night. Remember that Mr. James wasn't alone on October 2nd, 2014. He had his Army friend, J.T. Sanborn, with him. Both of these men who sped up to Pete's car as he was pulling out and charged up to Pete's driver's side door. Mr. James was angry enough to hit Pete's car, but he wants you to believe that he wasn't angry enough to hit Pete. But he was so angry, he couldn't recall most of what happened during the fight. The only thing he remembers was pulling Pete into a bear hug and then getting into a wrestling struggle. He couldn't even say that Pete hit him first. That's how mad he was. William James was the aggressor that night. He told you that Pete hit him on the top of the head when he was walking away, yet that wasn't in his statement. And when he told you about the injuries on the stand today, he only talked about injuries to the front of his face. His story doesn't add up. After the prosecution called their witnesses, we had the opportunity to call our own. We called two witnesses who told you the facts that the prosecution ignored in their open and closed case. You heard from Kelly Bradshaw and Pete Mitchell. Kelly told you how she saw Pete with his legs trapped in the door of his car, and she saw him attacked by William James. The state tried to poke inconsistencies in Kelly's story by stating that she was driving at the time she observed the fight, so surely she couldn't observe and drive at the same time. They told you that she had to divide her time between observing and driving. But do you remember who was also observing and driving at the same time as the fight was going on? The officer. The officer who made the arrest. They told you, Officer McNulty got up on the stand and told you that he was driving very slowly, but he was still able to drive and see through the trees what was going on. So what, it's okay for their witnesses to drive and observe at the same time, but not for ours? It doesn't add up. The prosecution also tried to harp on the fact that Pete had been drinking that night. But again, do you remember who else was drinking that night? William James. So again, what, it's okay for their witnesses to drink, but it's not okay for our witnesses to drink? Pete took the stand and told you about his injuries from being trapped in the door. Pete explained that he did what he had to do. He defended himself. Members of the jury, we realize that William James is a war veteran, and we are incredibly grateful for his service. But being a veteran doesn't allow you to escape the penalty of the law. It doesn't allow you to escape the consequences of your actions. And it was William James who was the first aggressor on October 2nd. So when you deliberate today, don't stereotype like the cops did on October 2nd, and the prosecution is doing before you in this very courtroom today. Cops saw a decorated war veteran and a kid with long hair and a baggy hoodie. Before they secured the scene, before they took any statements, before they looked at any evidence, they decided who they were going to believe that night. Members of the jury, don't be as blind as the cops and the prosecution. Do the only thing that the evidence in this case allows. Find Pete Mitchell not guilty of first-degree assault and disorderly conduct.
May it please the court. Members of the jury, sometimes cases are open and closed. When you have evidence, like you have of this brutal attack, and a defendant on the scene saying he didn't act in self-defense, not mentioning a single injury, sometimes it's pretty clear what happened when the evidence was written with blood. Now, the defense tried to cloud your judgment. They mentioned the flashlight that was found on the scene that didn't have any blood on it. But members of the jury, that's the same flashlight that the defendant took the stand today and said he used to beat Willie James in the head. They tried to say that William James doesn't remember anything that happened. Members of the jury, Willie James was just beaten in the head with a flashlight. Obviously, his memory would be a little rough. Members of the jury, there was only one person on the scene without injuries. One person who was covered from head to toe in blood. And one person who lied to the officers. That person is the defendant. And the truth was written with blood. It's not hard to close this case. Find the defendant guilty.
All right. Well done, folks. Well done. So,
First and foremost, thank y'all for being here. If y'all want to go and just give like a few comments, a couple minutes of comments or whatever you feel most comfortable with. Like we said, Monica and Stephen are our competing team. Monica will here in the next few minutes switch to this side and compete with another girl that's on the team. So any comments and stuff y'all have would be great and greatly